Hello and welcome to Let's Review. Game of Thrones. It's a show that became popular due to a combination of good writing, good acting, strong world building, and a fairly epic amount of both sex and violence. This game is not the first attempt to create a game to tie in with it. However, I do think it's the more interesting, given that it is made by Telltale Games. As such, as this game runs from about the tail end of Season 3 to roughly the middle of Season 4, there will be spoilers for the show in this review. My apologies for that. Still, with that said and done, let us look at Telltale's Game of Thrones, and let us start, as we always do, with the gameplay. This is a Telltale game, and as such, there's nothing really new to the gameplay. It's very much a basic framework around which to hang the story and the decisions. It's mostly a little bit of walking around, a little bit of interacting with the environment, but it mostly comes down to dialogue choices and the occasional QuickTime event.
This is the standard gameplay of Telltale's Game of Thrones. Unlike usual, I haven't recorded anything specially for this, I'm just using footage taken directly from the Let's Play. So as you can see, you can occasionally move around as you desire, but mostly you're confined to cutscenes like this one. Throughout these cutscenes you will come up with various dialogue choices in response to things that happen. So at this point, this is early in episode 1, where Geralt has just come across a group of bad guys who have killed some pigs on his family farm. Suffice to say, he is less than happy about this. In a moment you'll get a dialogue choice to decide how you're going to react to these people. So you can either draw your sword or you can run to your father. Now I chose to draw my sword because, well, that's my solution to most problems. From here you will go into one of the game's standard QuickTime events, which are, well, a QuickTime event. You've seen this kind of thing before. It's pretty basic, but it gets the job done. So they do a little bit of a threaten. You go through a lot of this kind of thing. There's a lot of dialogue, and then there's the occasional button prompt, and you react to it. And really, that's kind of it. There is nothing terribly complicated about the gameplay of Telltale's Game of Thrones, but it is reasonably well presented, and some of the fights do look reasonably interesting.
As with most Telltale games, this is not what you're playing the game for. That's not to say that it's bad at all, it's just very simple, and it ultimately is just something to keep you involved as the story moves on. Which means that, naturally, it now comes time to look at that story. So is it any good? Well, the story follows House Forrester, a small northern house who are bannermen to the Starks. At least until the end of the prologue, because that's when the Red Wedding happens. Lord Forrester is killed during the ambush, and his squire Gerard flees back to their main keep of Ironrath to inform the rest of the family. From here, you begin to follow multiple members of the family, and, in addition, Gerard, as they tell a story that spans a fairly substantial part of the Game of Thrones universe. How many are we talking about here? There are 4 main plots, each of which weave in and out of each other. The main one focuses on Ironrath itself and the new Lord Ethan, who is about 13 or 14. In addition to that, you have his elder sister Mira, who is a handmaiden to Lady Marjorie down in King's Landing. You've got Gerard the Squire, who ends up getting sent north to the Wall. And then, last but not least, you have the second eldest brother, Asher, who was exiled across the Narrow Sea. This family seems rather conveniently placed to run into many of the show's main characters. And there you have put your finger very precisely on the nub of the problem. An awful lot of characters from the show turn up. Mira has personal meetings with Cersei, Tyrion, Marjorie. Gerard gets mentored by Jon Snow up at the Wall. Ramsay Snow turns up at Ironrath. and Asher has a conversation about dragons with Daenerys. And the big problem is that most of these interactions feel like they've been really shoehorned in. That is not an uncommon problem with spin-off media. Yes, but it becomes part of the second problem. There are certain characters who you know are not going to be affected significantly by the events of this game, because you know they're going to go on to be in the show. Ramsay Snow, for example, does something spectacularly psychotic and evil towards the end of the first episode, and while House Forrester discuss ways that they could try and get their revenge on him, you know that ultimately nothing is going to come of it, because Ramsay's comeuppance has to come in the show itself because he's a main character. And that, frankly, is really annoying for all the people who are effectively cameoing from the show. Well, what of the original characters then? For the most part, they're pretty good, especially a lot of the main characters. The villains, I'll be honest, are a bit one note. They're a family called the Whitehills, who are rivals to the Forresters, who have basically teamed up with the Boltons to steal control of the Forrester family's ironwood, an important resource, which has of course never been mentioned in the show before. And honestly, the Whitehills pretty much come across as one-note bullies, because that is ultimately all they are. And frankly, that ends up feeling kind of like the whole theme of this game. Bullying. Yeah, bullying. It really is a case of House Forrester has been badly weakened, and everybody is taking the opportunity to screw them over, the strong picking on the weak. And it's a question of how do you choose to deal with that? Do you lie down and take it in the hope that at some point you'll get the chance to turn the tables? Or do you stand right back up and punch the bastards square in the nose and tell them that you're not going to stand for it? Frankly, that's when this game is at its most interesting and is the most fun to play. Not when it's shoehorning in characters who, frankly, have better things to be doing at that time. So, your problem with this Game of Thrones game is that it has too many connections to Game of Thrones. Well, yes. You do realise that that is one of the weakest arguments that you have come up with in, well, quite some time. No, because it ends up feeling like fan fiction, including characters not because it makes sense, but because it would be cool to see them. The thing is, I actually really like this game's story when it's focusing on its own story, because it does have some really fantastic moments. There's an extended sequence where one of the Whitehills is trying to keep you down, keeps telling you to stay down every time he knocks you down, and you can choose to keep getting back up. And it's actually a really, really good sequence. And when the game's doing things like that, its story really does shine. And if it could focus a little less on the unnecessary cameos, I think it would have been a far better game. Some people may well enjoy those cameos, but personally, I think it needed more focus on its original characters. Overall, the story is solid, it's just got too many unnecessary digressions. The graphics of this game are not great. Telltale games have never really been graphical powerhouses, but there's just something about this one that seems a little off. I think it's the attempt to do more realistic characters and ends up causing a little bit of uncanny valley. There's just something about them that's off. It's also worth noting that I did get a few frame rate stutters at a few points, and a lot of the load times are inexplicably long. Most of these are fairly minor issues, but they are things that you should be aware of. The art is something of a mixed bag. As I mentioned before, they've tried to go with a more realistic character look than usual. And I think this has backfired for them, at least partially because a lot of the backgrounds are extremely stylized. And frankly, this just creates a really weird contrast, and things about it just look off. I'm certainly not going to say that I dislike the art or even hate it, because a lot of the designs are carried over from the show, and frankly the show has some really nice designs for things. Overall, the art ends up simply being okay. I think it would have been a lot better if they'd been more consistent with it. The audio is also kind of mixed. The VO work in particular, some characters are really well voiced, and some fall a bit flat. And I'll be honest, it's mostly the cameo characters from the show who fall flat, because every one of them is played by the actor or actress who plays them in the show, and you can tell the ones who have VO experience from the ones that don't. They're not used to projecting all their emotions through their voice, so they don't do it, and some of their dialogue comes across very flat. Honestly, that's an experience thing, and granted, I would prefer to have those characters played by their actors from the show rather than just getting in someone else, so I think those people just need a little bit more practice at it. As for the rest of the audio, the music is fine but unmemorable, and pretty much the same thing goes for the sound effects, though I will admit there are a few quite satisfying sounds when something particularly violent is happening. Overall, the audio is a mixed bag. Some of it's pretty good, some of it is not so good, and overall, it's merely okay. So, did I enjoy Telltale's Game of Thrones? In spite of the problems I have with it, yes I did. Should you buy it? Of the two Telltale games that I've played this year, this is definitely the weaker. That doesn't make it bad by any means, but I don't think it's worth full price. If, like me, you can manage to pick it up during a Steam sale, you'll absolutely get your money's worth. Although that does come with a caveat that if you're not a fan of the show, you will probably be lost, and frankly I would not recommend this to anyone who isn't caught up till at least the end of Season 4. Now, if you'll excuse me, there's 2 weeks to go until Christmas, and I still have quite a lot of shopping to do. I'll see you later.
When winter comes, when life is frozen, when the moons they hide away under the snow,